In this video, we'll review the second part of Chapter 27, Empire and Expansion. Hinging the open door in China. After China's defeat by Japan, 1894 to 1895, imperialistic European powers, Russia and Germany, moved in. The growing group of Americans viewed this vivisection of China with alarm. Churches worried about the missionary strongholds. Merchants feared the Europeans would monopolize China's markets, and there were demands that Washington do something, so the Secretary of State, John Hay, decided on a dramatic move. This is a picture of American missionary Grace Roberts teaching in China in 1903. The Open Door Note was dispatched by Hay in 1899 to all the great powers, which urged them to announce that in their leaseholds or spheres of influence that they would respect certain Chinese rights, the idea of fair trade, and that Hay had not bothered to consult the Chinese before issuing this Open Door Note. The phrase open door quickly caught the American public's fancy and caused much more squirming in leading capitals of the world, though all the great powers, save Russia, with its designs on Manchuria, eventually agreed to it. The patriotic Chinese did not care to be used as a doormat by the Western powers, so in 1900, a group called the Boxers broke loose with the cry, "Kill foreign devils," in the Boxer Rebellion. They murdered more than 200 foreigners and thousands of Chinese Christians. They besieged foreign diplomatic communities in the capital of Beijing, which was Peking, and the multinational rescue force of 18,000 soldiers arrived from the United States and other countries and quelled the rebellion. This included several thousand American troops dispatched from the Philippines to protect U.S. rights under the 1844 Treaty of Wangai and to keep the open door propped open. The results of the Boxer Rebellion were that the Chinese assessed an indemnity of $333 million. The American share was $24.5 million. Since that was more than necessary, the U.S. remitted $18 million for the education of Chinese students in the United States. This initiative was to further westernize Asia. Secretary Hay released another set of notes in 1900. Henceforth, the open door would embrace the territorial integrity of China, in addition to commercial integrity. Incorporated into the Nine-Power Treaty of 1922, which was later violated by Japan's takeover of Manchuria in 1931. This is a picture, a political cartoon titled Columbia's Easter Bonnet. Many Americans felt a surge of pride as the United States became an imperial power at the dawn of the 20th century. But later, America's world role proved hotly controversial at home as well as abroad. Imperialism or Bryanism in 1900. McKinley was renominated by the Republicans in 1900 because he won the war and acquired rich real estate as a result. He had safeguarded the gold standard, brought promised prosperity, and Theodore Teddy Roosevelt was selected as the vice presidential candidate. William Jennings Bryan was the odds-on choice of the Democrats meeting in Kansas City, and their platform proclaimed the paramount issue as Republican overseas imperialism. The campaign had McKinley again campaigning safely from the front porch, while Bryan again took to the stump in a cyclonic campaign. Roosevelt out-Bryaned Bryan, touring the country with revolver-shooting cowboys. He denounced all dastards who would haul down Old Glory. So the election results came in, and McKinley triumphed by a much wider margin than in 1896, winning by 292 to 155 electoral votes. This was a victory for the Republicans, but not a mandate for or against imperialism. If there was a mandate, it was for two P's, prosperity and protectionism. New York bosses looked forward to watching the meddlesome Roosevelt take the veil as vice president. McKinley was murdered in September of 1901 by a deranged anarchist in Buffalo, New York. Roosevelt assumed the presidency at the age of 42, the youngest president thus far. He was a Rough Rider during the Spanish-American War who had high-voltage energy. He preached virile virtues. He denounced pacifistic flubdubs and mollycoddles. He was an ardent champion of military and naval preparedness, and his pet proverb was "Speak softly and carry a big stick, and you will go far." This is a picture of Theodore Roosevelt giving a speech in North Carolina in 1902. He loved people and mingled with all ranks, from Catholic cardinals to professional prize fighters. TR commanded the idolatrous personal following, and believed people believed during that time period the president should lead boldly. He had no real respect for delicate checks and balances among the three branches of government. As president, he felt the president should take any action in general interest not specifically forbidden by the Constitution. This is the picture of cutting through the Continental Divide in Panama, preparing the Panama Canal. Roosevelt applied his energy to foreign affairs. One of these areas was building the Panama Canal. The Spanish-American War had reinvigorated interest in a canal across the Central American Isthmus. The battleship Oregon, stationed on the Pacific coast, took weeks to steam around South America to join the U.S. fleet in Cuban waters. A canal would have made it easier to defend Puerto Rico and Hawaii and the Philippines, and it would also facilitate operations of the U.S. Merchant Marine. The initial obstacles were legal rather than geographical. Under the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty with Britain in 1850, the United States could not secure exclusive control over the Isthmian route. This focused on the rising Germany, and Britain eventually yielded to the United States because it was so focused on Germany. They consented to the Hay-Pauncefote Treaty in 1901, which gave the United States a free hand to build a canal and conceded the right to fortify it as well. But the question remained, where should a canal be built? American experts favored the route across Nicaragua. Agents of the old French Canal Company were eager to salvage the costly failure at the S-shaped Panama. And Philip Bunavilla of the New Panama Company dropped the price from $109 million to $40 million, so Congress in 1902 decided on the Panamanian route. Colombia rejected the offer of $10 million and the annual payment of $250,000 for the zone across Panama. Roosevelt railed against those who frustrated his ambitions. The impatient Panamanians were ripe for another revolt, and they counted on the prosperity to follow the construction of the canal, and feared the United States would turn to the Nicaraguan route. Bunavilla was disturbed by the prospect of losing the company's $40 million, so he helped incite a rebellion in Panama on November 3, 1903. The U.S. naval forces then prevented the Colombian troops from crossing the isthmus to quell the uprising. Roosevelt moved rapidly to make Panama a virtual outpost of the United States. 3 days after the insurrection, he extended recognition. 15 days later, Bunavilla signed the Hay-Bunavilla Treaty in Washington. The price of the canal was left the same, but the zone was widened from 6 to 10 miles. The French company pocketed $10 million from the U.S. Treasury. Teddy Roosevelt did not actively plot to tear Panama from Colombia. Conspirators knew of his angrily expressed views and counted on him to use his big stick to hold Colombia at bay. His involvement did leave an impression that he had been party to the intrigue. Thus, the so-called Rape of Panama marked an ugly downward lurch in U.S. relations with Latin America. Construction began in 1901, and daunting difficulties from labor troubles to landslides to lethal tropical diseases began. Colonel William Horace was a quiet and determined exterminator of yellow fever in Havana. He ultimately made the canal zone as safe as a health resort. At the cost of $400 million, autocratic West Point engineer Colonel George Washington Goethals ultimately brought the project to completion in 1914, just as World War I started. This is a picture of Teddy Roosevelt and his big stick in the Caribbean in 1904. The Monroe Doctrine came into play during this time period as well, and Latin American debt defaults prompted Roosevelt to get involved. Venezuela and the Dominican Republic were chronically in arrears to European creditors. Germany bombarded the delinquent Venezuela in 1903. Roosevelt feared the Germans or the British might remain in Latin America, which was a violation of the Monroe Doctrine. So he issued the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, which was a brazen policy of preventive intervention. He announced that in the event of financial troubles in Latin America, the United States would take over the customs houses, pay off their debts, and keep Europeans on the other side of the Atlantic. No outsiders could push around the Latin Americans except for Uncle Sam, who called themselves the policemen of the Caribbean. This became effective in 1905 when the USA took over the tariff collection in the Dominican Republic. This is Teddy Roosevelt's rewriting of the Monroe Doctrine, and this did more to promote a bad neighbor policy in Latin America. It was used to justify wholesale interventions and repeated landings of Marines, which turned the Caribbean into a Yankee lake. To the Latin Americans, it seemed like a cloak behind which the U.S. sought to strangle them. The shadow of the big stick fell on Cuba in 1906, when revolutionary disorders brought an appeal from the Cuban president. U.S. Marines landed and would be withdrawn in 1909. This was seen by Latin Americans as the creeping power of the Colossus of the North. Roosevelt charged into international affairs as well with the outbreak of war between Russia and Japan in 1904. Russia wanted to access the ice-free ports of China's Manchuria, particularly Port Arthur. To Japan, Manchuria and Korea in Tsarist hands were pistols pointed at Japan's strategic heart. The Japanese responded in 1904 with a devastating surprise pounce on the Russian fleet at Port Arthur. They administered a humiliating series of beatings to the inept Russians. This was the first serious military setback to a major European power by a non-European force since the Turkish invasions of the 1500s. Tokyo secretly sought U.S. help to sponsor peace negotiations, and Roosevelt was happy to oblige. At Portsmouth, New Hampshire in 1906, Teddy Roosevelt guided the warring parties to a settlement that satisfied neither side and left the Japanese, who felt they had won the war, pretty resentful. Japan was forced to drop its demands for a cash indemnity and Russian evacuation of the Sakhalin Island. Teddy Roosevelt received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1906 for his negotiations between Russia and Japan. The price of his diplomatic glory was high for the U.S. foreign relations. U.S. relations with Russia soured when they accused Teddy Roosevelt of robbing them of their military victory. Revelations of the savage massacres of Russian Jews further poisoned American feelings against Russia. Japan felt cheated out of its due compensation, and both newly powerful, Japan and America, became rivals in Asia as fear and jealousy between them grew. The Pacific coast also felt the effects of the Russo-Japanese War. Japanese immigrants poured into California, and only 3% of the state's population. Although they only made up 3% of the state's population, white Californians still ranted about the new yellow peril. A showdown came in 1906 when San Francisco's school board ordered the segregation of Chinese, Japanese, and Korean students into special schools to free more space for whites. This started an international crisis as Japan regarded this action as an insult, and war talk sizzled on both sides of the Pacific. This is a young Ho Chi Minh who attended the Congress of the Socialist Party in Tours, France, where the French Communist Party was created in December of 1920. This is a map showing the great powers and their colonial possessions as of 1913. Roosevelt invited the mayor and the Board of Education to the White House and eventually brokered a deal. The Californians repealed the school order. Tokyo agreed to stop the flow of laborers to American mainland by withholding passports. This became known as the Gentlemen's Agreement of 1907 and 1908. Teddy Roosevelt did not want Japan to think the USA feared them, and Roosevelt's dramatic scheme to send the entire battleship fleet on a highly visible voyage around the world indicated this. Late in 1907, 16 sparkling white, smoke-belching battleships started from Virginia. The commander declared that he was ready for a feast, a frolic, or a fight. This is a picture of Japanese workers building a road in California in 1910. The Great White Fleet, as it was called, received tumultuous welcomes in Latin America, Hawaii, New Zealand, and Australia. They had an overwhelming reception in Japan, which was the high point of the trip. Tens of thousands of school children waving tiny American flags sang the Star-Spangled Banner. The United States signed the Root-Takahara Agreement with Japan in 1908 and pledged both powers to respect each other's territorial possessions in the Pacific and to uphold the open door in China. For a moment, the two powers found a means to a peace. This is the chronology from the chapter.